Okay, looks like we should get started here. So welcome again. My name is Katie, and I have the pleasure of talking to you today about rental agreements for farm buildings and leases. Now, if you have any specific questions, feel free to put them in the chat, or feel free to let's see. I think you'll have the ability to unmute yourself and ask questions if you'd like and have specific ones. That generates a lot better discussion than me continuing just to talk at you. So on our website, what hopefully you're seeing on your screen is a kind of an overview of one of the Ag Lease 101 publications. And this is the full publication. It's quite lengthy. It's 17 pages. Goes into a lot of detail. These were originally created back in 2013 by colleagues throughout the Midwest that specialize in either ag law or ag economics, and really focus on a lot of different aspects of what you want to look at when you're renting facilities. Now, it first starts out with, of course, establishing a rental rate. And, in our scenario that we started out with between the landowner and the farmer, they were renting basic cropland. Now, when you're going into renting buildings and facilities, there's some other things that you probably need to consider, and that is looking at some of these maybe more operating costs and fixed costs. And this article here kind of talks about that. For example, some of these ownership or fixed costs, look at trying to get a return on your investment. If you built a, machine shed, for example, and you want to rent that out, what can you be renting that for? And if you were to sell that property, for example, with that machine shed on it, what could you get instead and turn that cash that you'd be receiving into an investment, say in the stock market? So that, that kind of looks at that fixed costs, what else could you be using? But you also need to consider, what are my property taxes? What is the insurance I need to maintain my buildings? What are the repairs and maintenance I need to do to these buildings to keep them up to date, to be able to rent them out? And that's something you don't see necessarily in your farmland, your basic cropland rental. So of course, you're not always going to get some of those opportunity costs, factored back into rental rates. That's where that negotiating really comes into play. But we do have some information about and some resources about some basic rental rates that you can consider when you're looking at, some farm buildings. Now, there's some other special considerations, of course, when you're looking at facilities. Like I said, repairs. If it's a facility that still has upright silos, who's going to be repairing some of those components that we know break down in upright silos? Is that the landowner's responsibility, or is that the farmer who's going to be renting that? And having that up front instead of when the silo unloader breaks. Really good information to know. Maybe the landowner will cover costs that are over $500, but the renter has to cover anything that's under $500, for example. Definitely things to consider. If you've got cattle on a rented facility, who's paying for the water? If there's a problem with the well, who's going to be replacing that? Now, the well is kind of more of a fixed cost. That might be the landowner's responsibility. But if you don't have that in a lease, obviously the renter definitely needs that to continue to have water available for their livestock. Same goes for manure management. We certainly don't want manure to be piling up and the landowner to have to somehow be responsible for manure when it's the renter's livestock that are out there doing that. So who's responsible for manure management? But also insurance. Is the landowner maintaining basic level insurance? What is the renter then coming in to maintain, and who's paying for what? So having those things up front to make sure you're on the same page. And of course, time of payment, how often that payment is going to be made. But like I said, the importance of putting these things in writing encourages the discussion about both parties. Reminder, doing this annually, make sure that you're both on the same page and you don't forget. Repairs, large repairs might not happen for several years. And then they come up and you have to kind of go through that negotiating of who's going to pay for it. If you'd had that discussion up front, have it in writing, maybe review it on an annual basis. You remember, oh yeah, I'm the landowner. I have to make sure that, when the tenant is paying me rent, I'm saving some of that to make sure I can afford some of these larger repairs on the property. And also, unfortunately, there's always potential of death, and having a written agreement in writing makes sure that it's a great guide for the heirs. If there's something that happens to the farmer who's operating that facility, even the landowner, both heirs have an agreement in place to know what's going to happen going forward and the next steps that are out there. So any questions that anybody has? I think you can unmute, or you can certainly put them in the chat if you're able to. Any specific questions you have? I'm not sure if I see a timer. They put one up for us to see how many more minutes, but.
Was the last time the Ag Lease 101, is that the newest one, is from 2013 yet?
So it was originally done in 2013. They have been updated in actually 2019, but they are still under review.
Okay.
Unfortunately, they're still under review by, I think, an attorney at the Ohio State,
so it's not
the Ohio
out
State.
yet.
No, it is not outdated, but of course, as laws change, things go through review. There are certain pieces. So if you have specific questions, I do have a draft copy, but this is what I'm showing here on the screen is what's available as the latest one. So if you go to the aglease101.org website, you'll find this. It gives a lot of great, very detailed information. And then towards the end of the agreement, there is a sample lease. Now, of course, we always encourage people to either create their own lease, use this maybe as a template, have it reviewed by an attorney, but it's a starting point at least. So thanks, Ashley, for that question. Does anybody else have any questions?
I'll go. I have a question for you, Katie.
Sure.
So in the dialogue in the videos that we watched, and you mentioned earlier to, have that starting price that you'd like to ask for rental rates. And I know when we talk about land and pasture, we have the reports that are done by the USDA to kind of give us a gauge of what those rates are. But for buildings and other facilities, how do we go about maybe calculating that? Or is there a place we can go to get some rough estimates of where to start? Or can you help me walk through that process?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Heather. So on the Ag Lease 101, for example, they do have this farm building rental rate survey. And so we'll click on it and we will open it up for you. And I'll zoom in so you get a little bit better detail. Here is some initial rates that they did on a survey. Now, this is somewhat outdated. Let me find, it was done in 2014, but again, it's a starting point. And they surveyed, our states here in the Midwest. So it's a kind of a good representation, but it does give you some initial, ideas. They've got beef for finishing open lot and shed on a per head per day. And they kind of give you a range at least. Milking parlors, which I've given this information out quite a bit of a range. And, of course, anything with is supply and demand. And so if there's a lot of demand, you might have to pay more. But if there's very little demand, again, it's a starting point. And then you go through and say, her machinery here in grain storage, what, as a landowner, what is it going to cost me to keep these things insured, to keep these things in good condition, to keep these things operating for that renter? And so if you have grain storage facilities that are decades old, is that adequate? More so, as we get back into, for example, in the case of my husband and I initially started renting a dairy. It was an older dairy barn, and it was not conducive to raising beef cattle. And so we did not pay any rent for the actual barn. We simply used the open lot and a shed that they had outside. And it was really hard with that landowner that he didn't understand why we were not paying rent for that barn, but yet the barn was there and it was available. So we did have to pay a little bit and include that within the rental rate for the buildings and facilities. And so that's part of that negotiation process too, to looking at things. So. But yeah, on this machinery storage, you can see, there's 1 to 10 years and over 10 years, and you can see how there is a noticeable doubling of rates in there as well. Yeah, go ahead, Heather. You had another question.
I did. So I noticed on this report that it says it was done in May of 2014. Do you know how frequently they update it, or like since this is, I would consider 14 relatively old as a publication, do you think how accurate or how reliable are these rates that are on here?
That I don't know. I have not seen an update since 2014. I know they were updating and reviewing the lease agreements and the information that was provided. But I don't know. And so again, it's a starting point. I think Iowa State has some reference. I think our former colleague, Dave Kummel, has some information. His was more on pricing new, and modernization. But yeah, I think it's somewhat of a challenge here. And especially knowing if these rates are good or not. So I don't have a better answer for you on that, Heather. I'm sorry.
No, I appreciate what you said. So thank you.
Yeah, and the other thing, especially if you're a renter and you have a lender, and you certainly need a lease agreement if you're going to obtain a loan or operating loans, and that lender wants to see that you have a lease agreement, knowing what you and the landowner are going to negotiate. But then, again, it goes back to these improvements. If something breaks, who's going to pay for that? And as a lender, lenders are certainly going to be trying to make sure there's operating needs that are going to be met. My example of the upright silos, those can be pretty expensive because some parts are pretty hard to find depending on the type of silo that you might have. And, so lenders certainly going to want to budget for that. I know, sometimes the lender or, even lenders with the Farm Service Agency, for example, are able to provide you with the loan to upgrade and have those improvements done. They might have a filing for fixtures, something like that. But again, you need the agreement with the landowner that you are able to do those type of improvements. Now, you certainly don't want to go ahead and do improvements without the landowner's, permission in there. So, looks like we're closing our breakout rooms here in less than a minute. But I do know of a situation where they went into an older dairy barn. They upgraded, they tore out stalls, they put in, kind of pens without the landowner's permission, and then wanted the landowner to reimburse them for all those, improvements. The landowner says, no, you're not really improving my barn. You're not really improving the facilities. It's not helping to grow my numbers, my dollars, my assessed value of the property. And so, the farmer had to eat that cost. Always make sure you're having that discussion with the landowner before you're doing things. So appreciate your time today. If you have other questions, again, put them in the chat. I think we're going back into the main room to have a little Q&A again. So thank you.